In the most recent challenge run I did of Thousand Year Door, I tackled the entire game without using Mario at all. His partners were the only ones that could attack, and while it definitely made the game harder and more fun from that perspective, it made a lot of the normal enemy encounters in the game fairly slow and tedious to get through. I ended up skipping the majority of regular enemies throughout the entire game, only fighting some of the ones that I happened to run into. This experience got me thinking, how many battles do you actually have to do to beat the game? And then from there, I realized an even more interesting question to ask. How few turns can you spend in battle in order to beat Thousand Year Door from start to finish? The most important thing to cover before we start is what actually counts as a turn in this game. I consider a turn in this game to be made up of Mario's actions, his partner's action, and then the enemy's actions. When the battle order loops back around to Mario, an entire turn has passed. So that means if Mario kills something on his first move, that's one turn, and if Mario and his partner both attack and kill something, that's still one turn, and if Mario finishes an enemy with the super guard on the enemy's first attack, that would also be one turn. There are moments in some boss fights where cutscenes or dialogue triggers and it can skip the boss's turn, and in cases like that, I would count it as an entire turn passing when it loops back to Mario. I don't want to make this too complicated right now because it really isn't overall, so I'll just point out any exceptions as we go along. The only rules I want to establish before we jump into this are: 1. No glitches. The answer to this question would be both tremendously complicated and incredibly difficult to actually execute if you brought glitches into the mix. This playthrough is assuming that you're an average person trying to do the bare minimum turns to get through the game. 2. In order to avoid this being excessively tedious for me to play through, I decided that if I ran into any optional encounters that I was allowed to run away from them without adding it to the turn counter. This way I didn't have to reset the whole game every time I got into a fight that was hard to avoid, and it did still punish me by losing a few coins each time I ran away. I tried my absolute hardest to avoid enemies wherever possible because I wanted to prove to you that you can get past all of them without encountering them, but I figured I would give that disclaimer because I'm sure a lot of you were immediately questioning that. Any encounters that are unavoidable still count even if I did decide to run away from them, by the way. And 3, there were parts of this run that I used save states for, and that was once again to avoid wasting a ton of time resetting on difficult or luck-based segments. Resetting the game to the last save and walking all the way back to wherever I was would prove that I'm patient, not that I'm good at the game or strategizing. As much as I love putting myself through hell for YouTube entertainment, I also have college classes and can't spend 500 hours resetting and walking through the silly Mario paper game. Other than that, there are no restrictions. I can use any items, badges, or strategies that are necessary to beat the game in as few turns as possible. The only other thing I want to say before we get started is for you to make sure and subscribe if you enjoy this Thousand Year Door content from me. I've said it before, I think asking for subscribers before they've actually watched the video and found out if they've liked it or not is a little tacky, but the last time I did it, I got more subscribers in one day than I ever had before. So if you're a repeat viewer especially and like what you're seeing, make sure to subscribe because it helps me keep making videos. Anyways, let's get this thing going. The first required battle of the game is of course Lord Crump. Since he has 5 health and Mario can only do 2 damage per turn, there's no way to kill this guy in one turn. Hitting the super guard on his first or second attack is required to finish this fight in the minimum amount of 2 turns. I made sure to grab some fire flowers from the item shop before continuing with the story because using one of those is the only way to kill the Goomba trio in a single turn. After that, it's just a matter of bobbing and weaving through the Goombas in the sewers until the next required fight, which is the big blooper. This early into the game, there's just no options available that allow you to beat the blooper on the first turn, so I resigned to Fire Flower and Power Smash it a couple times to kill it in 2. That makes 5 turns required for the prologue, and I don't think there's any way to save those turns without using glitches. The first leg of Chapter 1 for this challenge was making sure that I brought the right items with me, using a POW block on the bald clefs and bristles as the tried and true strategy for any playthrough, and then I made sure to bring a couple fire flowers to use on each of the fuzzies that ambush you after you collect the sun and moonstones. The gold fuzzy fight is another case where it just isn't quite feasible to beat him in one turn, since Mario and Goombella are still pretty much babies at this point. I can power smash and head bonk him on the first turn to deal 6, get through his attack turn, and then finish him with a couple jumps on the next turn. turn. I get my first level up here, and as always, I picked Badge Power. There's pretty much no reason to ever pick anything besides Badge Power for your first few levels, since there's literally an HP plus that you can get in like 5 minutes from now, and there's an FP plus you can get at the start of Chapter 2. And in this playthrough, each level up is actually going to feel like an event and a progression, since I'm going to be getting very few of them due to the whole skipping every single encounter thing. Next, I'm off to Hooktail's castle, where the next required fight is against Redbones and his 4 Dullbones minions. I kept this one simple and just used a Fire Flower with Koops and a Power Smash from Mario to take everything out right away. And now for our first kind of weird required turn. Right in front of the door to the room with Miss Mouse and the castle key, there's this Dullbones right here. Avoiding him is slightly tight, but simple enough to get into the room, but when you leave the room, he always spawns exactly where Mario walks to, forcing you into the encounter. It is kind of janky, but since there's no way to avoid getting into this fight, I think it still counts. Killing them in one turn isn't a problem, but that does add 1 to our counter. Avoiding some of the Dullbones in the next room requires a lot of finesse, but it's all reasonable, and I was able to avoid every other encounter between now and Hooktail. And speaking of Hooktail, well, this is where things already get pretty complicated. Hooktail has 20 health and then has a second phase where she recovers with 10 health. She also starts with 1 defense until you damage her with the cricket sound effect, which drops her defense to 0. This makes doing 20 damage to her in one turn with our current available moves and badges pretty difficult, or maybe even impossible. Initially, my plan was to grab every star piece that you have access to up to this point, which is exactly 15, and then grab a power plus from Dazzle so that Mario can power bounce Hooktail on the first turn and get past that 1 defense and still deal damage. As long as the first hit of Power Bounce actually does damage, the rest of the hits will still deal 1 each even though she has defense. The problem is, with how few battles we've done so far, I've only leveled up once and only have 6 badge power, which isn't enough to equip both Power Plus and Power Bounce. In this hypothetical though, if I did have enough badge power, I would then follow up with a multi-bonk from Goombella, who I can go back to Rogueport and rank up before taking on this fight. Another option that you might have already been wondering about would be if I were to simply get good at the video game and use a Power Smash to deal 3 and then multi-bonk 16 times for the other 17 damage I need, but the problem with that is that Hooktail and most other bosses in the game have a very low cap for power bounces or multi-bonks, so even if you time the buttons right for every hit, you will still get stopped from doing more after several hits. You can see this happening when there's still an excellent pop-up, but the attack ends. I don't have the deepest understanding of this mechanic, and I'm sure somebody can explain it better in the comments, but the odds of getting that many multi-bonks could even be impossible. I'm not quite sure, but at the very least, they are astronomically low. I explored some other mental gymnastics for how I could get this fight done in 2 turns instead of 3, but none of the ideas came close. Ultimately, I had to suck it up and spend 2 turns killing the first phase, and then killing the second phase in 1 turn was trivial. We're already up to 16 turns for this playthrough so far, but I have a feeling things are going to get a bit more efficient from here. And the reason that I say that is that after Chapter 1 is over, Charlieton spawns in Rogueport. Charlieton sells a ton of useful stuff, with by far the most useful being the Mega Rush badge. This makes it so that when Mario is at 1 health, he gains 5 extra attack power. The Mega Rush P badge has been available since getting Paper Mode, but Mega Rush P is garbage compared to Mega Rush in the specific context of this challenge, and I'll explain why. Getting Mario's partner down to just 1 health is very, very difficult to do when you're trying to spend as few turns as possible. The only way to do it without having to spend turns getting attacked is to use a Trial Stew item, but you can't even get those until much later in the game, so there's really no way to get the partner down to 1 health. Mario, however, doesn't have that issue. When you fall into an overworld hazard like water or a pit, Mario loses 1 health, so I can just spam that over and over to get Mario knocked down to 1 health without even entering a battle at all. This is going to be key for avoiding many required turns throughout the game, because that 5 extra damage goes a long, long way. After triggering Chapter 2, I immediately began preparing for what I knew was ahead. The next fight that I'd be taking on is the Shadow Sirens, which are 3 separate characters with 10, 12, and 9 health respectively. Basically, I have to find a way to do 12 damage to all 3 targets in a single turn, which is a big ask at this point in the game, but it's definitely doable. I'll admit though, I kind of overthought this one. I did the math and figured Mario could do 7 damage with a Mega Rush boosted Quake Hammer to all targets, which means I only had to do 5 damage with the partner's turn. Thunder Rages are an item that can deal 5 damage to every enemy, but they're pretty hard to come by this early into the game. Luckily though, I remembered that by earning 50 shot points, you can get given a free Thunder Rage from any item shop in the game, so all I had to do was buy 50 items and we'd have the answer to our problem. The fastest way to do this would be to buy and sell dried shrooms from the Westside shop and lose 1 coin per, but since I had so little money, I didn't want to do that. Instead, I opted to use the game's built-in early game money trick. You can purchase Sleepy Sheep for 8 coins from Rogueport and then sell them for 10 coins in Petalburg. In-game, you actually get this information from doing a trouble, but you're able to do this as soon as you make it to Petalburg for the first time. I made several trips back and forth, selling 4 batches of them and profiting by 80 coins. This took a little longer than you would think, but I guess it was worth it? Okay, no, it actually wasn't worth it, because apparently Charlieton, the guy that sells you Mega Rush, he also sells you an Earthquake, another item that can do 5 damage to every target. Oh, and a Shooting Star, which can do 6 to everyone. See why I said I overthought this one? I killed all 3 Shadow Sirens in 1 turn using Quake Hammer and Peril and then a Thunder Rage just like I planned out, but I could have just as easily used Earth Tremor and a Shooting Star and saved a lot of hassle. Oh well though, the end result is still the same, I did it in 1 turn. The next unavoidable encounter are these 2 X-Nauts that ambush you when you first enter the Great Tree, and they were simple enough to kill with a couple attacks since Mario's attack is boosted by Jumpman, which I also bought from Charlieton. After that, I avoided a couple enemies in the overworld and made sure to grab the Power Punch hidden in this bush. I didn't have a specific plan for it at this point, but I always make sure to grab every available item to me in any challenge playthrough. Let's just say this ended up being a surprise Mouseketool that will help us later. Fighting this X-Naut is required to get the key to rescue the Puny Elder and progress the story, so that's another turn for the counter. There's a big gap in required battles here, but there are a lot of incredibly annoying enemies to avoid throughout the tree. None of these were required, so the turn counter can rest for a second, but several of these were worth pointing out because of how creative I had to get. I also definitely had to enact that rule where I'm allowed to run away if I get into any of these non-required fights, because it was either that or save state, otherwise I would have been here for hours resetting to avoid encounters successfully. This challenge is actually the most useful Flurry has ever been for me in this game because her wind powers can actually stun enemies in the overworld for a few seconds, which makes some of the maneuvers I need to make a lot more feasible. I genuinely would not be surprised if nobody has ever skipped past this X-Naut without fighting him, like, ever, because having to line him up and stun him while also blowing the Punies across is absurdly stupid. And after doing that, I blew the Punies down this ledge here so that they didn't get scared by this Piter and scramble, and that was enough to carry them through the first Jabai fight without too much issue. After that, I had to go back, avoid all of the same fights again, and then repeat the last couple of steps but with 101 Punies this time instead of just 11. The next complicated portion of our program comes from getting all 101 Punies across this winding bridge section without them getting scared by the Piters. I thought at first that I would have to kill these Piters since the Punies scatter ridiculously every time they pop down. I experimented around a bit and realized that I could actually make it across with a decent number of them. So from there, I came up with a solid plan. In the room past the 100 Jabai fight, there's a pillar with a Puny orb slot, which means I can trap the Punies there easily. So all I had to do was win the Jabai fight, and then I could slowly work the Punies across until I had all of them stored up in the little Puny bank right there. The problem is, winning against 100 Jabais requires a lot of Punies. At first, I managed to make it across with just 55 of them, but I tried fighting with that squad, and I helped out with Flurry as much as I could, but in the end, it was not even close. So I left the room and immediately dropped back down, leaving my 55 Punies right next to the entrance to the 100 Jabai room. I rallied my other 46 little dudes and tried my best to time crossing while the Piters were up instead of down. Some of them got scared, but miraculously, I hopped across these blocks and went into the next room, and the game somehow registered me as having 87 Punies. I tried the Jabai fight again, and with some help from Flurry, I managed to pull it off and comfortably beat them. After that, I ran the play. I trapped the 87 Punies by the pillar and went back for the rest of the homies. I got another 7 of them across on the next trip and added them to the pile. And finally, I got the last 7 of them on the final trip. I'm honestly surprised I was able to do it in so few trips, and I think it definitely came down to luck. The next couple Pale Piranhas were hard to avoid and definitely tripped the runaway claws that I set, but they're definitely avoidable if you just don't suck at the game like I do. The only challenge left for this chapter besides the boss was to get 101 Punies down this hole without fighting the Pale Piranha. Once again, it's definitely possible, but I had to run away a couple times because of how persistent this motherfucker is. If you're trying to just play the game and you aren't doing a stupid challenge like this, just kill him, it's way easier. Beyond that, I made sure to use the water in this room to set Mario to 1 health for the upcoming boss fight so I could take advantage of Mega Rush. During the tree escape sequence, there's another pair of X-Nauts that ambushes you, so that adds another turn to the counter. And then finally, we get to Magnus Von Grapple. With a Mega Rush power bounce, I can deal a huge chunk of his health, and then a multi-bonk is able to finish him off before he can even attack, making that just 1 turn for Magnus. Surprisingly, I was able to get all the way through Chapter 2 with only 5 battle turns, which ties with the prologue for the lowest so far. And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be so lucky with Chapter 3. Oh boy. In a surprise to absolutely nobody, this chapter ended up requiring a lot of turns because of the whole battle arena thing it has going on. Luckily, a lot of these encounters are pretty easy to plan out and finish in 1 turn. The only major advantage I gained after completing Chapter 2 was the Power Rush badge for Mario, which can now be bought at the badge shop in Rogueport. This adds an extra 2 damage to my Peril Mario setup, which is definitely going to be important later. The main thing that complicates this chapter when it comes to optimizing turns are Grubba's fight conditions. Some of them can be worked around, like no hammer or jump, no attack with partners, or things like that, but there are other conditions that are straight up impossible and require a reset. Appeal to the crowd 3 times, don't attack for the first 3 turns, and take damage 3 or 5 times require an instant reset no matter what, since they take more than 1 turn to complete, and some of the other ones like don't use FP or don't use items will require resets on later fights that have bigger requirements for damage output. So, let's start banging these battles out. A Power Shell is all it takes to kill the Goombas, a multi-bounce plus Power Shell beats the KP Koopas, a Power Shell with a Power plus P makes quick work of the Pokies, and the Dolbones go down easily with yet another Power Shell. On the fight against Spike Storm, Grubba gave me the don't use FP condition, which forced me into using Goombella plus an Earthquake to kill the Lakitu and then the Spinies. I could have also used Earth Tremor, but Star Power is a lot harder to come by in this challenge since I don't level up much and can't spend turns appealing, and I'd have to go all the way back to a proper inn in Rogueport to actually recover it. The squad of bandits went down after a Power Shell and an Earthquake, and Grubba wanted me to use a special move against the Mind Bogglers, so I killed them with an Earth Tremor. I killed the Hyperclefs with a Quake Hammer into a Power Shell, and then did the exact same thing against the Bob-Ombs. For the second half of the Glitz Pit, turn counting gets a lot more complicated, so I'll make sure to point out every little nuance with it. You're required to encounter and lose to the Iron Clefs before Yoshi will hatch, so I started the fight and ran away to lose it, and then I came back with Yoshi to beat them properly. Oh, and by the way, for this challenge, I decided to name my Yoshi Min-Turn since this is the minimum turns run and I'm only limited to 8 characters. It is always very important to name the Yoshi something related to the challenge. And now right here is probably the biggest mistake I made during this run. When I fought the Iron Clefs last time, Grubba gave me the condition to take damage 3 times. Since I ran away on the first turn, I didn't satisfy this condition, which is considered worse in the Glitz Pit than losing the fight while still satisfying the condition. This means I was moved down a rank in the Glitz Pit and had to refight the bandit squad. Since I had already saved my game, this save file was effectively screwed. I decided to suck it up and refight them since I would have had to restart the entire game and redo the last 4 hours of gameplay, but I won't be adding it to the required turn counter since this fight is absolutely avoidable. I figured I would point this out because if for some reason you're crazy enough to follow along with this, that tip might help you out. It's also honestly just a good tip for avoiding doing an extra fight in the Glitz Pit on a casual playthrough, so there you go. I did get some star points from fighting these guys, which did give me an extra level slightly earlier, but ultimately I didn't take advantage of the extra badge power and it leveled itself out anyways pretty quickly, so it didn't impact the rest of the challenge. Anyways, back to turns that do count. Even with Power Plus Ps equipped, Yoshi's Gulp will always do 4 or 5 damage to the second Iron Cleft depending on whether you ranked him up or not, which I did. Since he has 6 health, there's no way around spending 2 turns to gulp these guys to death. Grubba gave me the Mario can't attack condition for the red spike tops, so I killed them with a Yoshi Gulp. The Bristles went down with a Quake Hammer, and then I took out the Shady Koopas with a multi-bounce plus Earthquake combo. After this fight, the Iron Clefs burst back in for revenge, and you naively might think that this adds 2 more turns to the counter since I can't kill them in 1 gulp, but you can actually run away from this fight with 0 consequences, making that only 1 turn. Grubba gave me the no using FP condition against the Fuzzies, so I took them out with an Earth Tremor instead, and then the Magic Koopa Masters were killed with a multi-bounce plus power shell. And then the scripted Bowser encounter happens. It is definitely possible to kill Bowser in one turn if I set up Peril Mario, but since I accidentally got extra star points from the extra bandit fight that I locked myself into, I decided to run away from Bowser instead. Just like with the Iron Clefs, this actually has no consequences other than missing out on the star points from Bowser. I bet very few people have actually read this dialogue before, and in fact, I'm pretty sure this was my first time ever choosing not to fight Bowser at this point in the game. Next up on the chopping block is the Dark Craw, which going into this challenge I thought for sure was going to require 2 turns to beat. He has 20 health, can't be jumped on, and you don't have access to Spike Shield until after chapter 4. But before calling it quits and spending 2 precious turns to beat him, I decided to do a little bit of math. Mario's base hammer damage is 4, call it 6 if I use a Power Smash. If I put Mario in peril, he gains 5 from Mega Rush and 2 from Power Rush, putting his attack up to 13. Stacking that with a Power Plus makes it 14, meaning that I could use a Shooting Star to deal the final 6 damage necessary to kill this guy. I didn't want to waste the 1 Shooting Star that I had since they're so rare this early in the game, so instead I went and reloaded Charlieton's inventory until I could buy Hammerman from him. Then I jumped into Rogueport Harbor over and over to set Mario down to 1 health, and altogether this put Mario's hammer damage up to 15, so I was able to slap Dark Craw with that and then finish him with a Thunderbolt item. Okay, well, I was able to do that after resetting a couple times because Grubba kept giving me fight conditions that made it unwinnable in 1 turn. The next fight was against the Hammer, Boomerang, and Fire Bro team, which was easy to kill with a Quake Hammer since I was still in peril. I did level up from them though, which healed me back up. I dealt with the Red Chomps by using a Gulp into a Quake Hammer, and then next I had to solve the Dark Koopa Troll. With 25 health and also being a spiky enemy, once again I had to stop and think. The strat I used against Dark Craw would not work because not only does this guy have 5 more health, but he also has 2 defense. I was thinking about some sort of strategy that used Quake Hammer to flip him over and then a multi-bonk to kill him with Goombella, but then I remembered a much easier option. I walked all the way over from Glitzville to Petalburg to buy a POW block, and along the way I also set Mario's health back to 1 using water. This let me flip over the Dark Koopa Troll with my partner's turn and then absolutely body him with Mario. Finally, I arrived at Raw Cock. I made sure to avoid healing and kept Mario in peril from the last fight since it's super annoying to go all the way back to Rogueport to bring his health down again. And by the way, the reason that I had to do that is because there are actually no overworld hazards in all of Glitzville. Grubba will always give you the condition to use a special move at least once against Rock Hawk, but as commenters have pointed out in previous challenges, it actually doesn't matter if you follow this or not because the story will progress either way. With Mario in peril, Rock Hawk talks a bunch of shit at the start of the fight and then literally dies within 5 seconds. All that's left for this chapter is to take on Macho Grubba, and obviously the peril strategy is the only path forward from here. I healed my FP with a honey syrup so that I could once again stay in peril and not have to go back to Rogueport, and then I went into the fight. Macho Grubba of course has 60 HP, which is far too much for Mario to deal himself in a single power bounce due to how early you get capped against this guy, but luckily I got a high cap multi-bonk with Goombella and killed the guy on the first turn, no problem. This is probably the easiest he's been in any challenge I've done of this game so far, but to be fair, none of the battles are actually hard in this challenge, it's just purely about planning. And in case somehow the number in the corner of the screen didn't give it away, it took quite a few turns to make it through this chapter. 25 to be exact. The entire story of the chapter is centered around battling, so it does make sense there'd be so many required turns, but from here I'm sure things will be much lower. And lo and behold, as promised, this segment is going to be much shorter than the last few. The only majorly important thing to note here is that it is absolutely crucial to knock Mario down to 1 health before facing Dupless for the first time, since there are no overworld hazards anywhere in Twilight Town as far as I can remember. Once Dupless steals your identity, you can't leave Twilight Town to go back to Rogueport at all until the chapter's over, so it's important to properly set up before beginning. Having Mega Rush and Power Rush and anything else that can boost Mario's attack is of course required before coming here, but I wouldn't have made it this far without having those things already, so that doesn't really matter. Getting all the way to and then through Creepy Steeple without getting into any enemy encounters ranges from annoying to downright tedious, but it is all absolutely feasible to do. The first Crazy Daisy on Twilight Trail is definitely the most difficult to avoid, but with a combination of luring it away and flurry, it's pretty reasonable. Slipping past the next few daisies is easier, and avoiding all enemies inside Creepy Steeple is super easy. I just moved through the main room quickly to avoid getting thrown out by the bamboos, and I made my way up to Dupless. Peril Mario is able to kill him in one hit pretty easily, but since he's scripted to turn into Mario, the game actually puts him back up to 10 health after he transforms. And once he transforms, you get put onto your partner's turn, so I would say that this still only counts as one turn for this whole battle. Mario's still grayed out from his action here, so I think this definitely counts as one turn. I did 9 damage with Goombella instead of the 10 that I needed, which would have been a reset, but then I managed to super guard Dupless, killing him awkwardly in the middle of the stage. Like I defined at the beginning of this run, this all still counts as one turn because there are 2 player actions and then 1 enemy action. But if you're being picky about it, it is possible to do that 10 damage with just Goombella. From here, it's just a matter of doing all the backtracking that the game makes you do in this chapter. Going back to Twilight Town, back to Creepy Steeple, back to Twilight Town again, and then back to Creepy Steeple one last time is pretty much exactly the same, and none of the enemy encounters are required, so the last thing to do for Chapter 4 is to defeat Dupless a second time. My options are severely limited since Mario is on his own at the start of the fight, but since I stayed in peril for this whole time, my attack is still to the moon. Mario can kill Dupless in a single power bounce, completely skipping the scene where Vivian resolves to join Mario. The funny part about this is that the game just proceeds completely normally after, as if Vivian actually helped or even said anything at all. The developers never intended for you to be able to beat Dupless in one turn, and based on how stupid this strategy is, I can definitely see why, so there's actually no failsafe or special dialogue that makes the scene adjust to this scenario. Anyways, that's it for Chapter 4, and as promised, it was much shorter than the last one. It's also the lowest chapter so far in terms of turn counts at a massive whopping 2. That's some good shit. Chapter 5 continues the trend that Chapter 4 sets, where you're cut off from the rest of the map during the duration of the chapter, so once again, it's important to bring everything that I need before shoving off to Keelhaul Key. Luckily, due to the fact that it's like kind of an island or something, Keelhaul Key is full of water that can damage Mario, so I don't need to worry about any BS where I have to set up peril strats before I leave. There isn't much new stuff available to me now, so I pretty much hopped right into it after clearing Chapter 4. The only funny thing that I want to point out about the start of Chapter 5 is that I have to pay Gus to pass over to the east side of Rogueport multiple times to prevent having to fight him. It's annoying and expensive, but so is life, so that doesn't really matter at the end of the day. The first required battle of this chapter is against 3 Embers, which are easy enough to kill with a Thunder Rage and Power Shell. The next required battle is also against 3 Embers, and I dealt with them the exact same way. Avoiding the jungle enemies is pretty easy overall, so it's not really worth talking about. Heading into Pirate's Grotto, I did think I was gonna have to fight these Build Blasters on the bridge, but I found a really stupid workaround. It's completely free to pass the bills themselves using Vivian, but once you get to the actual blasters, well, they have pretty chunky hitboxes. I went ahead and made a save state right here because otherwise this was going to take an eternity. I messed around with trying to hop around them from many different angles and found that you can just barely jump around the front of this fence and get past them, no battling required. When it comes to the next Bill Blasters in the grotto though, I wasn't so lucky. Avoiding the bullet bills is super easy once again, but this time there's just no way around the blasters themselves. I tried dozens of times with different jump angles, but these boys are just too damn thick to get past. I killed each pair of them with a gulp, so that adds 2 more turns to our counter. And after that, you have to kill this Ember to get the key for the last curse chest, and I beat them exactly the same way as I did with the other ones. And beyond that, nothing gave me any more issues. You do have to pass the first set of Bill Blasters again, but now that I knew what to do, it was pretty easy to repeat history here. And now, that brings us to Cortez. Cortez has 3 phases with 20 health each, and by setting Mario up for peril strats beforehand, I can actually defeat each phase with a single normal jump attack. Each time he swaps between phases, the turns reset and let Mario go again, so I would count each of these phases as being a distinct turn. Normally Cortez will heal himself if given the chance on the 3rd phase, but killing him in one move prevents that from happening, leaving Cortez at a 3-turn fight. Lord Crump is a bit more of an interesting story though. I went into it with Mario in peril, of course, and was able to kill Lord Crump on the first turn like always. After that, he heals up and it actually doesn't take up a whole turn. Mario's partner is given the next action and Mario is grayed out since his turn is over. The disappointing part about this is that there doesn't seem to be any way to kill Crump on this action. If I could get Goombella or Yoshi in peril, then maybe it would be possible, but like I previously mentioned, there's no real way to do that without using up turns elsewhere in the game. The only possible way I could ever imagine successfully killing Lord Crump in a single turn would be to abuse Merlin Merly spell buffs to deal more damage with the partner attack. But even then, you would need a pretty unlikely multi-bonk cap to make that happen, since her curse only buffs an attack by an extra 3 damage. So if Goombella was super rank, had 2 power plus Ps on, and received a Merly curse, she would start at 7 for her base damage, and then each hit after would of course decrease. That means you would need 9 multi-bonks in a row against Crump to kill him in one turn, which while possible is pretty damn unlikely to happen. Combining that with also needing to either manipulate or get lucky and roll a Merly spell, this makes this a very difficult turn to skip. I was going to try and set up Merly for this, but I read JDAster64's blog post about Merly's mechanics, and I think I ended up more confused instead of less confused. I say all of that to say this. I ended up using 2 turns to kill Lord Crump. I used a power bounce on the first and second turn, and that did the trick, but with a lot more research and testing, this seems like it might be the most likely turn to be skipped so far. If anybody watching this has the time to mess around with this, feel free to reach out to me through Discord or Twitter or whatever, because I'm curious if this would be doable at all, but for now that's beyond the scope of this video. In total, it took 10 battle turns to beat Chapter 5. Chapter 6 is an interesting one to talk about in the context of this challenge because in previous videos I have claimed that it has the lowest amount of required battles in the game, with that being just the chapter boss. That isn't entirely true though. The beginning of the chapter starts off conflict-free. Well, battle-worthy, conflict-free anyways. There's still definitely some chicanery going on this train. The train once again locks you off from the hub world until you finish the chapter, but this time it is far more important than with Chapter 5 to be fully prepared. I got the up arrow and double ranked Goombella, Koops, Yoshi, and Bobbery. I also got various items, bought and sold some badges, etc, etc. The most important thing that I did was go to Chet Rippo, who is available now that we have Bobbery, and downgrade Mario's health to 5 and upgrade his FP to 15. Now what I should have done here was move that level from HP to BP instead of upgrading flower points, but I'll explain why in a second. Anyways, the first part of Chapter 6 that has any enemies at all is Riverside Station. All of the enemies inside are easy enough to avoid except for these 3 Goombas right here. For some reason, the developers decided that to unlock the 3 switches in this room, you need to defeat 3 battles of 3 regular-ass Goombas from Chapter 1. I don't know what they're doing here, I don't know what their objectives are, they make no sense. At first, you might think that this adds 3 required turns to the counter, but that would only be the case if I didn't buy the First Strike badge. First Strike is generally not a very useful badge, and in fact, I would say this is pretty much the only point in the main story that it's even kind of useful. It allows you to defeat weak enemies in the overworld with a First Strike, but only if they're weak enough compared to Mario that they wouldn't award you any start points. Even though I'm only a pathetic level 8 at this point, that is strong enough that Goombas wouldn't give me star points, so using the First Strike badge, I can wipe out all these little fungus men from my screen, unlocking the switches and letting me progress forward. While this definitely feels like a weird gray area, I would argue that this absolutely does not count as spending any turns to defeat them. It's a weird edge case, but hey, I will always take whatever technicalities I can get. Beyond that is the Smorg, who, spoiler alert, was probably the most difficult boss to lab out in this entire challenge. He starts the fight being invulnerable, and you need to defeat his 3 tentacles in order to actually deal any damage to him. On top of that, he has 50 health. Now, this doesn't sound too complicated on paper, right? I mean, I could just use a Thunder Rage with my partner and then Peril Power Bounce with Mario and... well, no, I can't do that. In order to progress the game to the 3rd and final day on the Excess Express, Mario has to sleep in his bed and pass the night. Doing this will heal Mario no matter what, there is no way to avoid this. And since there's no overworld hazards on the train, Mario cannot enter the Smorg battle in the peril state at all. I had brought along a Trial Stew, which is an item that knocks Mario or his partner down to 1 health and gets rid of all your FP, but it can't be used in the overworld. I had also made sure to grab the Double Dip badge, but I couldn't think of any combination that would make Trial Stew work. For Double Dip, I had to use a Thunder Rage as my first item to kill the tentacles, and then I could use a Trial Stew to bring Mario or even Goombella to 1 health. But the problem with that is then I would have no FP left to multi-bonk or rally wink and pass the turn back over to Mario. I experimented around with Yoshi since his ground pound works kind of like a weaker multi-bonk that doesn't need FP, but even with Mega Rush P, Power Rush P, and 2 Power Plus Ps, that's a lot of PPs, Yoshi can only do 45 damage to the Smorg, just 5 shy of killing him. So I had to think of a different approach, and this is finally where Chekhov's Power Punch comes into play. It's been sitting in the shop storage since I last mentioned it in Chapter 2, and finally it's going to be relevant. The new game plan was to double dip Thunder Rage and then Power Punch onto Mario, Rally Wink, and then Power Bounce for the kill. Since Mario's permanently at 5 HP now, he also always gets the 2 damage buff from Power Rush. That stuff combined with Ultra Boots, the P up D down that I got during Chapter 6, and my other attack increasing badges brings his Power Bounce damage to 10. Now the reason I said that I should have moved my level into BP instead of FP earlier was because then I could have afforded my second Power Plus here, which would have brought the first hit of Power Bounce to 11. The main difference that this makes is that instead of getting fairly lucky, I had to get very lucky. In order to kill the Smorg in one hit under these conditions, Mario had to get 8 bounces in a row. It would have only been 6 had I been able to put on that other Power Plus, which is actually fairly common to get even with boss Power Bounce caps, but since I saved my game several times since then, I had to play it where it lies. I decided to use save states because otherwise it would have taken almost 5 minutes per attempt between reloading the game, walking back to the end of the train, going through all the cutscenes, etc. It took a couple dozen reloads, but eventually I managed to get not only an 8 cap, but I actually got 9 Power Bounces in one turn against this guy, which more than seals his fate. Like I said, this would have been easy if I had just made a better choice earlier because I was getting 6 caps on average, but oh well, nothing a little save stating can't fix. Beyond that, the only battles left to avoid were the Dark Booze and Poshly Sanctum, which were super easy. After all of the science that I had conducted to make this chapter happen, Chapter 6 has become the new frontrunner for fewest amount of turns with just 1 battle turn required to get all the way through it. There's no way that Chapter 7 or 8 are going to top that since they do in fact have battles in them, so GG Chapter 6. And both fortunately for me and unfortunately for you guys, this is where things get much easier. I try to avoid using endgame Danger Mario strats in these challenges because it just completely destroys the entire game, but in this case it made total sense to me to use since there's kind of no other way to defeat these bosses in the minimum amount of turns otherwise. Plus, since this challenge is all about planning and not so much about execution, I think it makes sense to give ourselves the easiest time to make things as smooth as possible. Doing Frankie's Trouble that unlocks after doing Chapter 6, you can earn the gold card for the Pianta Parlor, which allows you to purchase Power Rush and Power Rush P badges for just 36 Piantas. The fact that you can buy unlimited of them for so cheap, combined with the fact that you can permanently set Mario's health to 5 HP, is incredibly ridiculous and always will be. And in the spirit of having assignments due at midnight, instead of grinding for an hour plus at the slot machine or games in the Pianta Parlor, I use save states to roll 7s back to back. There's actually nothing random about these slot machines. You can learn the timing for them, but the timing is tricky, so I opted to stick with being a little cheater boy. In just a few minutes, I amassed like 600 Piantas and bought as many Power Rush badges as I could equip. Now with all of this, Mario's attack was 39 damage per jump, which is absolutely monstrously disgusting. And with that, I headed into Chapter 7. None of the battles in Far Outpost or even on the moon are required, although like I mentioned in the last full game challenge video, avoiding these yuxes on the moon is unreasonably difficult. Once I'm in the X-Naut Fortress, Mario's ambushed by 2 elite X-Nauts, so that adds 1 more turn to the counter. Throughout the whole fortress, there are enemies in all of these tight hallways, but using a combination of Flurry and Vivian makes them easy enough to get past without fighting. It is still definitely a little bit tedious though, I mean look at this. I ended up making it the rest of the way through the chapter scot-free, and then I reached Magnus von Grapple 2.0. This guy has been an absolute pain in the ass in every full game challenge I've fought him in so far, so this one actually ended up being really refreshing. He has 70 health and 2 defense, and since my attack is just so insane, I'm able to kill him with a single regular jump attack. So gratifying after everything this bastard has put me through. And so that ties Chapter 7 with Chapter 4 for having the second lowest amount of required turns at a measly 2. And finally, we arrive at the final chapter in the game, but things will be much easier than they usually are thanks to Big Daddy Danger Mario. Most of the normal enemies in the Palace of Shadow are surprisingly easy to avoid, but the Bombshell Bill Blasters gave a bit of issue. These bills are actually spaced out enough that you can walk in between them, but the Bombshell Blasters still have fat and juicy hitboxes that you can't get around, so you're required to enter battles with each of them. Killing them with Mario isn't an issue of course, but there are 3 different pairs of them in this dungeon and none of them are avoidable, so that already matches how many turns I've needed to beat the last 2 chapters. Darkbones and his Drybones minions are easy to kill with a single multi-bounce, and he gives me an ass ton of star points. And then Gloomtail is also trivial. Gloomtail is another boss that's given me a lot of issues in challenges, so killing him in a single hit painlessly, I mean, painlessly for me anyways, I'm sure that hurts him a ton, is so good. The Riddle Tower has a room where you have to defeat a Dull Bones, Red Bones, Dry Bones, and Dark Bones all in that order, and luckily I'm able to use First Strike again to defeat the Dull Bones. Since I'm still so disgustingly underleveled, it actually isn't able to kill Red Bones because he still gives me 1 star point, so I have to add 3 more turns from these guys. Next up is the Shadow Sirens rematch, and since I have All or Nothing now, I was able to get Mario's attack up to exactly 40, which is a perfect kill on Dupless and Marilyn, and overkill on Beldum with a multi-bounce. Once again, absolutely gorgeous. Avoiding the enemies in the second half of the Palace of Shadow is a little trickier than the first half, but still easy compared to things like what Chapter 2 and 4 put me through. So finally, with every potential regular enemy encounter in the game behind me, I approached the final 3 boss fights of the game. I used a Thunder Rage to kill Grotus's little shield boys, and then killed him with a regular jump. To kill Bowser and Cammy in 1 turn, I jumped on Bowser with Mario, rally winked with Goombella to give him an extra move, and then jumped on Cammy. And finally, that brings us to the Shadow Queen herself. In the last video, I incorrectly mentioned that you need Spike Shield to jump on Shadow Peach due to her crown, and I'm honestly not sure where I pulled this detail from other than out of my ass. I could have sworn that when I played this game as a kid, I wasn't able to jump on her because of the crown, but I guess that's some weird revisionist history bullshit because that is just straight up a thing that does not exist. Right away, I power bounce and way overkill her, which sends her into her invincible phase. Her transforming resets the turn back to Mario, which in my mind means an entire turn has passed. After that, all you can do is spam her with attacks that do nothing until she moves on to the second phase. I made sure to load Mario up with defense increasing badges as well as 2 close calls and a pretty lucky to make sure that he survives this part since he only has 5 total health. After 3 whole turns of hitting her for no damage, the cutscene where she absorbs the audience triggers and the first phase ends. And after witnessing everyone telling Mario to not give up or something, Phase 2 starts and Mario is able to immediately body her with a huge power bounce straight to the dome. Without Danger Mario strats, finishing this phase in 1 turn would be impossible, but with them it is completely free. This totals up to 16 turns in the final chapter of the game, with a quarter of those coming from just Phase 1 of the Shadow Queen. In total, it took 77 turns in battle for me to beat Paper Mario the Thousand Year Door. Well, glitchless, of course. I have no idea how much lower that number would be if glitches were allowed, and maybe that's a rabbit hole for another day, but I would definitely need some help from Thousand Year Door scholars on that one. The majority of battles in the game I was able to do in a single turn, and most of the ones that took more than 1 turn were due to separate phases or cutscenes that happen regardless of how much damage you do. Shadow Peach was the enemy that took the most turns, but it wasn't because she was the really difficult final boss at the end of the game, but instead because she basically has 3 cutscene turns. And out of everything throughout the whole game, I think the most likely turn to be saved would be the second turn that it took to beat Lord Crump in Chapter 5. Like I mentioned earlier, I think that some form of Merlee spell manipulation could be potentially used to deal enough damage with Goombella to kill the second phase in a single turn, but I didn't set that up on this save file. It's also possible this method could be used to save the second turn on Hooktail or even Gold Fuzzy, because I'm pretty sure I remember Merlee being available that early. And also maybe one of the turns against the Iron Clefs could be saved if there's some way to kill them in 1 turn instead of 2, but the game is rock solid when it comes to ways to circumvent their defense, so who knows really. In a surprise to nobody, Chapter 3 had by far the most required turns, but I was surprised how many Chapter 1 and 8 had especially. I guess it makes sense because Chapter 1 is meant to be more tutorial-like and Chapter 8 is meant to be a finale to the game. Now normally at the end of one of these things, I offer to make a follow-up video where I tackle the Pit of 100 Trials under the same rules as the full game challenge, and the reason I usually separate those is because the pit ends up being long and would make the whole video overwhelming, but in this specific case it would not make for a very long video, so now I'm going to state right off the bat that I did not actually attempt the Pit of 100 Trials on this save file, and here's the reason for that. Assuming you're tackling the pit in an endgame state with the Mario loadout I have now, it is technically possible to beat the entire Pit of 100 Trials with only 1 turn spent in battle. What you're looking at right now is a tool-assisted speedrun created by YouTuber Malio, where he speedruns the Pit of 100 Trials from the very start of the entire game all the way down to beating Bonetail. By manipulating RNG, it's possible to get a mover to spawn on every single floor. You don't even have to pay them to move down, you can just move on for free and have one spawn on the next floor. In his task, he actually does let a Dark Koopa spawn on floor 31 so he can get a Mega Rush P as a drop from it, but since I don't need that in this theoretical pit run, I don't have to worry about that. You could theoretically get a mover to spawn on that floor also, and you can ride this wave all the way down the pit. Besides the one encounter that he intentionally did, he didn't fight a single other enemy. So if I were to make this happen from an endgame state, I could just ride the mover wave to the bottom and kill Bonetail in a single power bounce with Danger Mario. So that makes the hypothetical minimum turn count for the Pit of 100 Trials at just 1 turn spent in battle. No glitches are required to do that, just insane, literally dream Minecraft levels of luck. Anyways, thanks so much for watching all the way through this video. If you weren't convinced by my subscriber begging at the beginning, maybe you watched all the way through this video and decided, you know what, yeah, I'll support this guy. And if that's the case, make sure you like and leave a comment also, because those little things help tell YouTube that I'm doing a good job and that they should show my videos to more people. And so, I will see you guys next time.